So, welcome to the second of the Brown Bag Conversations. It's an experiment in talking to people who run interesting businesses that sit adjacent to what we at Equal Experts do. If you want to find out a bit more about the thinking around the experiment, I've just popped a link to a blog that I wrote at the beginning of the year in the chat. If you're watching this on catch up, then hopefully I will remember to make sure that the link to that article goes into the email that gets sent out. The second of the guests on this little series is Tom Geraghty, somebody I've known for a few years. Delighted to get some time with you today, Tom. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Excited to be here. Fabulous.
Now, the topic of conversation and the topic that your business now is focused on is that of psychological safety, and it's a theme, an idea that has been talked a lot about at Equal Experts for a few years, and is very important to what we do, and it's something that we, I think, to some extent, there's still a bit in the foothills of in terms of thinking about how we run teams that operate psychologically safely, and it's definitely something that we're still learning about. Before we talk a bit more about how you got to be doing what you're doing now, and to talk about what it is your business now does, I thought it'd be useful just to kick off with maybe what your working definition of psychological safety is, because it's quite a broad concept.
Yeah.
So I can put you on the spot right from the start by saying, go on then, tell us what it is. So how do you explain it to people?
So good question. And there are, so there's a couple of sort of canonical definitions from the research and from the literature, from academia. One is the team is a shared belief that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking, right? Which is accurate, but I don't know if it's that useful. It doesn't really tell you what's happening in the team. Another definition, this is from Amy Edmondson in her book, The Fearless Organization. And it's a shared belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. And the reason I like that one is because it highlights these four things, these ideas, questions, concerns, and mistakes, because that's really all we have to remember. You know, can I or someone in the team speak up with an idea, suggest an idea, take it out of our heads and show it to people, ask a question, because by asking a question, we're admitting we don't know something, raise a concern, which is kind of interpersonally risky because we're potentially sort of suggesting that someone else made a mistake or someone else did something wrong or that there is something wrong. Or admit a mistake, which again is sort of opening ourselves up and being vulnerable, and that requires psychological safety. So I think, yeah, definition of psychological safety, really you only need to remember ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes.
That's neat. But sometimes the way in which my brain works, are there any things it's clearly not?
Oh yeah. So well, there's quite a few misconceptions, quite a few myths around psychological safety. So one is that it's about sort of I've heard it sort of being called coddling, like being overly nice or sort of soft or sort of sheltering, protecting people, and that's not the case. It can be perceived by maybe by some managers who are used to sort of more traditional Tayloristic kind of approach to management as being too soft, being just too nice and friendly and fluffy, and that's not the case. And if anything, it's actually about raising standards, raising accountability for our own behaviors in the group, and raising that standard of behavior within the group, and raising the accountability for those standards or breaches of those standards. Yeah,
that's interesting. And we talk a lot about health and safety at work. Do you think there's a relation between psychological safety and mental health safety?
Yeah. So I guess there's kind of 3 points there. So one is that in many ways, if you're talking about physical safety, psychological safety is a precursor to physical safety. we are unlikely to be physically safe if we're not psychologically safe. And I work with a lot of safety consultants on this idea as well. And one great example is where there was an example actually of someone got injured on a building site who wasn't wearing a hard hat because they'd sort of, there was a culture of sort of banter and like banter / bullying, and that they and a culture that if you wore a hard hat, you're a bit soft. And no doubt most of the people in that group on that site did want to wear a hard hat. They wanted to be safe, but the interpersonal pressure was such that they didn't wear a hard hat, and they didn't feel psychologically safe to say, you know, I'm going to wear a hard hat, and someone got injured as a result of that. And that's a sort of how that dynamic can work, and even to the degree of, you know, raising concern. So if you don't feel psychologically safe to point out, I think that machine's broken, or I think that machine's dangerous because there's a flappy bit on it or something, that's dangerous, right? So there's that interrelation between safety and psychological safety, but there is also the mental health, wellness, and well-being aspect that in an environment of a lack of psychological safety, we say, yeah, we feel more anxious, we feel stressed, we're more likely to burn out, we're less likely to ask for help if we don't feel psychologically safe to do so. And it's asking for help that is fundamentally necessary to our mental well-being at work or anywhere else.
Yes, and it's interesting. There's so many factors, aren't there, as to why people might not want to do that. Not being an environment where you feel you can is probably the one above all else.
Yeah.
Before we go on, just to remind people, we have got a Q&A thing within Zoom webinar. So if you have a question, please drop them in there. There'll be some time at the end of this to be able to go through any I haven't answered. But if I can see them as they go, I'll also try to be able to artfully weave them into the conversation as we go, as if I'm able to multitask by having a conversation with you and watching a question thread coming in. We'll see how it goes. One of the things that I find most fascinating about you, Tom, is that I think there are some stereotypes about who might be going out and talking about some of this stuff, and that people who come from maybe less engineering kind of backgrounds might be more predisposed to be out there going, we need psychological safety in organizations. And that's very much not your path, is it? Your career is science and engineering, basically.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about where you came from.
So I got a degree in, well, ecology, for want of a simpler phrase, a degree in ecology and related subjects, and then moved into sort of ecological research. My job title was experimentalist, which is still by far my coolest job title, and still the one that I identify as. So I've retained that. I'm keeping that one. And so after doing that for a few years, I then moved into technology, so became a sysadmin, and then moved into infrastructure management, managed IT teams, engineering teams, then software development teams, and became director of IT, CIO, CTO, and had various roles in companies ranging from hyperscaling startups to big finance corps, and most recently Red Hat, the Linux open source company. And now I'm doing psychological safety. Yeah.
So it's a path that's gone through a number of the kind of aspects of technology engineering. And I think the first time you and I spoke was probably 4 or 5 years ago. And we interviewed you for my podcast, WB40, available on all good podcasting channels. And you were talking then not about psychological safety, but about DevOps and DevOps as a concept. And actually what it really struck me at the time was that you were talking about it in a way that wasn't focused on the technical parts. You weren't talking about pipelines and continuous integration or, you know, any of the tooling or any of those kind of things. You were talking exclusively about how DevOps was a way of thinking, about how DevOps was a way of people organizing themselves, and about how teams operate.
And I think and to a degree that's what's most interesting about DevOps, and that's what kind of hooked me in. And I think if we go back a little bit from that, the thing that in hindsight catalyzed my interest in safety cultures and DevOps and all the related sort of subjects was that I worked in an IT department where there was a culture of fear. It was led by a director who created a culture of fear, created a culture where zero tolerance for mistakes, zero tolerance for defects, and punishment for mistakes. And that was sort of what, and I saw the impact that had on the organization. It meant that everyone planned to like spent weeks planning a small task because the risk of failure was so great, the punishment for failure was so great that it was better to spend weeks planning and succeed than try and fail. And everything got kind of out of date, and the company suffered as a result. And I saw that, and I thought, well, if that type of leadership leads to that, the opposite of that type of leadership must lead to success. That was my logic, right? And so, and it's kind of true. But what over that journey, I think what I kept hunting for, and it's the same in DevOps. What I kept hunting for was like, what's the foundations? What's deeper than this? What are the causes and foundations of all of this? Like technological success, the foundations of that was sort of a lot of the DevOps principles. And then you start to dive into that, and you realize, oh, there's stuff that people have already solved and already discovered through this theory of constraints, quality, Deming, lean, socio-technicality, sort of the acknowledgement that systems are machines and people, and we can't treat people as machines, and likewise. And then essentially you start to get as almost as far down as you can get, and you start hitting sort of psychological safety and safety cultures. And that's sort of where I landed at it, realizing the foundation for all of this work. You can't do anything, or any of this, without psychological safety. None of it works without psychological safety. So that's sort of where I landed there.
And that's quite counter to some of the prevailing management thinking that goes on in organizations, and just probably reared its head more in the last 30 years as technology has enabled more stuff to be treated like a production line rather than as interactions between people.
Yeah. And I think it's fair to say, I think what's really interesting is that some of the highest performing teams I know do put a lot of effort into technical applications, tools, procedures, and systems, technical systems that help mitigate and prevent failure and risk. And it's interesting to note that the teams that put a lot of effort into those systems also tend to be relatively high performing and relatively psychologically safe. And I think it's the same sort of behaviors. I'd love to dive deeper into this, because I think it's the same sort of behaviors and same conversations that occur that enable us to put in robust and resilient practices and tools to help us deliver software faster. That conversation is the same conversation that fosters psychological safety. And in fact, this kind of cyclical, it's kind of a feedback loop, a virtuous cycle of being able to have that conversation means we can build great tooling. We can't build the great tooling without having a conversation, and that tooling fosters psychological safety because it helps us. It's a strong signal that we care and we acknowledge that humans make mistakes. We wouldn't put in those pipelines and tools if people didn't make mistakes. We wouldn't need them.
Yeah. Yes, and there's often also, I guess, a challenge where people expect everything to be perfect. This striving for perfection, this striving for zero errors, which in some circumstances is really necessary. You know, if you're building aeroplanes, it helps.
So that's so there's a slight tangent, but there's a fantastic story about John Boyd of OODA loops. John Boyd was a fighter pilot back in the Vietnam War and became a test pilot and a trainer. He's the guy that inspired Top Gun.
Yeah.
And when he was at Elgin Air Base, they implemented a program of zero defects being a big, like the paradigm of the time, this zero defects submission. And he rallied against it and said it was it was harmful. This striving for zero defects isn't going to result in zero defects. It's going to result in people hiding defects, changing what a defect means, so that once something that was a defect is no longer a defect, and other sort of mechanisms at play that actually mean you're not actually reaching zero defects. You're just manipulating the situation so it looks like zero defects, but actually you're probably making more mistakes.
Yeah. Fascinating. So, and there were some wonderful questions coming through, one of which I'm going to pick up on now, which is from Julia, because this will segue us nicely, I think. So, why did you switch your focus from technology delivery to psychological safety? Was there some sort of Damascene moment when the lights emerged and you went, this is my mission, or has it been an evolution over time, or was it a bet?
Yeah. So that's a good question, and it's kind of both. It's definitely kind of both, because over the past decade or so, I've been I've been leading and managing and doing stuff that it turns out I was trying to foster psychological safety. That was the thing I was trying to do, but I didn't have the term for it. I didn't know what to call it. I was just doing what I considered to be the right thing. And then back in around 2017, 18, I came across a video by Amy Edmondson, an old TED Talk video. It's an old grainy video of a TED Talk she did back in 2012, I think. Really awful quality video, but spot on. And it's just an 11-minute video, and it for me it was just a proper light bulb moment. And it was a light bulb moment of, this is what I've been trying to do. This is suddenly I've got a name for it. This is the stuff. And I didn't realize that it had a name before that point. And of course, when you've got a name for it, suddenly all the doors open. You can start to hang your hook on things and read stuff about it, and it opens up all the doors to other stuff. And so that was the moment. But kind of up until that moment, and since then, it has very much been an evolution. And moving from technology delivery to psychological safety, psychological safety isn't the goal of organizations. I think we've talked about this before, that you don't strive for psychological safety. I mean, you might, but you strive for quality, performance, commercial success, saving the world, helping, saving patients' lives. Whatever it is the organization is trying to do, that's what you're striving for. But psychological safety is the foundation upon which all that is built. So that's the realization. Like psychological safety is the necessary condition in which you can do technology delivery or manufacture cars or teach people or whatever it is you're doing.
And you're not limiting yourself now to just technology.
No,
that's your, where you've come from, but you're looking at. So let's talk a bit about the types of clients that you have now. Who are the sorts of organizations who are reaching out to you to be able to get a bit of Tom help with psych safety?
Yes, and this is, to be honest, this is what makes the job really interesting, because technology is interesting, but it's even more interesting doing what I'm doing now, because I'm working with healthcare organizations, so part of the NHS and healthcare organizations in other countries. I'm working with local and national governments, aviation, heavy industry such as gas and electric, and manufacturing, like mining. I've got a client list up here, so I'm sort of looking at that as well. The music industry, technology, academia, there's various housing organizations, agricultural companies, and all sorts of other things. And that's what's kind of fascinating about it, because lots of different organizations, lots of different domains have come up with different practices and paradigms and programs and things to kind of address psychological safety, or at least that help contribute to psychological safety in these sorts of practices. But for example, healthcare people in healthcare rarely learn from people in technology, and likewise, because those two domains rarely converge. What's really nice is that I can be working with a technology team, and they'd introduce me to a practice called, for example, Schwartz rounds, or after action reviews, that I can then go to a technology firm and say, did you know these folks over in clinical teams are doing this, and I think we should try this because this would work really well in this context. But those things rarely bleed over, so that's what's really fascinating.
And that connection across sectors is really interesting. There's the almost classic example of the airline pilot who very tragically lost his wife because I think they like left swabs and things inside her. Yeah. And he is obviously massively grief-struck by this, but then also angry. And then what could he do about it? And what he did was to be able to help to introduce the idea of checklists, which are just common currency within the aviation industry, into the world of surgery. Yeah,
and in fact, and a similar effect has transferred the other way, where there's now an appreciation in aviation for the dynamic between pilot and co-pilot, for example, which has been the cause of a few plane crashes, where a junior co-pilot hasn't spoken up and pointed out a mistake that the senior pilot has made. And they haven't, even though it's a really obvious, like they throttled down the wrong engine or something, and they haven't spoken up because of the power dynamic at play. And this had been previously observed to be a problem in surgical teams, where someone doesn't point out to the surgeon, "Oh, you've left the swab in, or you've left the scalpel in, or you're cutting off the wrong leg," or something like that. And this is why checklists and things were brought in, but also mechanisms by which a nurse, who is in theory rather junior to a surgeon, a nurse can stop the surgeon. A nurse is expected to stop the surgeon, and the surgeon can't go ahead without the say-so of the nurse at the end of the table. And the same sort of dynamic has been brought into aviation. It's called cockpit resource management or crew resource management, and it's that similar sort of paradigm.
That's fascinating. And what are the sorts of triggers that your clients have? So there's one thing about the sorts of clients that you have, but are you noticing any common events or scenarios that mean that you are getting people making inquiries?
Yeah, so there's a lot of triggers, and it can be all sorts of things. Some of the common ones are high sort of defect rates or high problem rates, high mistake rates, or high error rates. A lot of things are going wrong, and we're trying to work out why. That's one catalyst, one trigger for it. But another one is a lot of people saying, we don't feel psychologically safe. We have a problem here, but we don't know what to do about it. And often sometimes that comes from somewhere near the top, but not at the top, somewhere just under the top layer, which is always really interesting. Someone who's able to see the effects of the sort of C-level leadership and the effects of that in the organization, where someone else may be blind to it or feel like they're not empowered to actually do anything about it, and that's just the way things are. So there's that, and then but I think we come back to the goal. The goal of most organizations is not to foster psychological safety. The goal is to be successful. But so often people will come to me because they're realizing they're not being successful, or they want to be even more successful. We've been through COVID. We know we need to be more resilient, adaptable to change, learn from change. How do we do that?
Actually, there's one of the questions that's come through from Evangelo, which is related to something you just said then. I think it's an interesting one to bring out now. So how does one address a C-suite colleague and inform them that the cultural narrative set out by the CEO isn't aligned to their last post, email, Slack message, etc., therefore directly impacting psychological safety? How do you go about tackling that?
So really good question. That's a lot of the work we do. So a lot of the work we do is talking to C-level folks and running sessions specifically for C-level folks. And what we tend to do is we in a safe way for folks at that level, introduce ideas, stories, topics, and discussions about big failures and big successes. So big failures, we might talk about Challenger, Chernobyl, the Volkswagen emission scandal, things like that, and then big successes, and look at the common threads around it and the behaviors, particularly of leadership, that have fostered, have either caused disasters or fostered success. And people at that level, want to avoid massive disasters, want to avoid rockets blowing up on the launch pad or whatever the equivalent is, and they want to be really successful. So they just want to see how to do it, and they don't want to feel like they're doing something wrong. They want to feel like we can do something even better. So we run a lot of those sessions that are designed specifically to speak the language of execs.
I think that also taps into something that Mark Steed has asked, which is what steps would you take to help an organization recognize that their culture is having a negative impact on psychological safety?
So good question. And I think, the word culture there is interesting or tricky, but like culture is the behaviors and the things we do and how we communicate with each other. That's what culture is. And so we change culture by doing things differently and communicating differently. It's sometimes the way we sort of talk about culture change can be tricky in itself, because we're actually talking about changing the way we do things, but a lot of people don't want to change the way we do things. We're quite happy as we are, thank you. So we need to introduce practices, behaviors, and some of the, that might be checklists. That might be introducing checklists. It might be introducing new tools. It might be introducing practices such as the and-on chord, or retrospectives, or after action reviews, or some other sort of things that we can start to introduce into teams, depending on what their particular challenges are, and where those pockets of psychological safety, like where the good pockets are, where the pockets that are having some trouble are. But there's other things we can do, like creation of communities within an organization that can then share best practice across different teams.
Yeah,
stuff like that.
You've talked about some of the activities that you do. Are there other things in terms of the nature of the engagements that you have with your clients that I guess maybe people, because I imagine there's kind of set things around training and learning and development type activities, workshop type activities. Are there any other things that maybe people wouldn't necessarily think would be part of the offer that you do?
Yeah, so we often end up, once we've started doing quite a few workshops, we often end up in a situation where we find there's a problem here, or a lack of capability, or something over here that we didn't realize before. So maybe that's a misalignment of value streams. Maybe the actual value streams of the organization aren't aligned to the way the teams are actually structured, and that's causing a core friction within the teams. Or maybe there's some really poorly defined teams and processes, so there's a lot of difficult handoffs, lots of documentation required, all that sort of stuff, which then fosters a what's the word I'm looking for? It causes friction between people and teams.
Yeah,
and so and then we start to dive into that and try to resolve that, and that might be through maybe a little bit of reorg, but maybe team charters, team APIs, and things like that help define what a team does and how they do it compared to another team, or help make some of the things that were implicit explicit, and that means we can address them and change them.
And as we've moved into a increasingly hybrid or geographically distributed world of work, has that put more pressure, do you think, onto issues around psychological safety? Is it changed? Is it easier?
It's definitely changed. In some ways it's easier, in some ways it's harder. For some folks it's definitely harder. But for the folks who are really, really used to being in the office and being able to see everyone and get a lot of their energy from physically being in a group of people in the same place, definitely harder. For others though, it's made things quite a lot easier, because it's kind of, once we've learned how to do it, it's kind of almost codified the way we work. We have to have a bit more structure and a bit more codification about about how we communicate and how we work together. What tools do we use to communicate with each other? How, when and how do we meet, and in what format, and things like that. And that that predictability, that structure, that wasn't always present in a shared physical space, because you could just get up and go and see Bob over there. This distributed nature has sort of resulted a lot of the time in a better structure, more predictable structure for many people. But it's where but not everyone is comfortable with that, and so we need to address that. And
yeah, and I guess alternative structures like that can be in many different ways. One of the things, I'm 10 months now into my work at Equal Experts, and one of the big draws for me was the fact that we don't have a traditional management hierarchy. And so I don't have a boss, I don't have performance reviews, any of those things. And that's brilliant. And that's one of the reasons why I'm now working for EE. But it's also quite unsettling, because there are a lot of givens about hierarchical management styles that it's drilled into us from school.
Yeah.
And if you remove something, or you remove the office, or you remove something, then that's going to unsettle, I guess.
Yeah, well, actually, one of the quite persistent myths about psychological safety is that it necessitates, or it requires, the removal of hierarchy, or rather, that the presence of hierarchy can damage psychological safety. And that's quite a persistent belief or myth, but it's not really true. In fact, it's not true at all, because if you look at so both the US Armed Forces, US Army in particular, and the British Army are focusing quite strongly on psychological safety as a foundation for high-performing teams, high-performing squadrons, and such like. They have an incredibly hierarchical structure, and it's very, very defined. Your role is very well defined. Who you report to is well defined. What your boundaries of action and decision making capability, or how far you can make decisions, is very well defined. And if you go outside those boundaries, you probably will be punished. But the presence of those boundaries, the presence of that hierarchy, actually fosters greater psychological safety, because you know exactly where you are, what's expected of you, where you stand, and what's equally as important, what you're not supposed to do, and what where you need to go for help or escalate. And that's really powerful. But just like you said, where that becomes ambiguous, that becomes a real problem. Just the removal of hierarchy and the sort of chasm of ambiguity left over, that would really damage psychological safety and performance, because we wouldn't know how to prioritize, or what we're meant to do first, or how well we're meant to do something, or when something's finished.
Yeah, and it's something you and I have spoken about before as well, that a lot of the existing literature around psychological safety is sort of presumptive of the idea of people who are employed to work for an organization in a long-standing role.
Yeah.
And so for a professional services organization like EE, there's also some interesting challenges there about how you bring together teams with the expectation that those teams are performing quickly and going through the whole Tuckman stuff of forming, storming, norming as quickly as you can, but also being able to allow them to operate. And often the parallel I've drawn with this is with where you've got crews, so aircraft cabin crew, or to an extent a football or a rugby team, or a film crew, where you've got teams that are brought together at short notice. Sometimes an international football team or a film crew often won't know each other from previously working, but they've got very tightly defined role descriptions, which means that they can get up and running quite quickly. And I think sometimes with professional services teams, that's a challenge, because we think we know what the roles are, but they're probably more ambiguous than a grip or a best boy or a centre forward or a fullback.
Yeah, exactly. And there's kind of two aspects to that as well, probably at least two. One is that without that clarity of role, without that clarity of structure and definition, we might not know what to do, how to do it, what to do first, and those sorts of things. So we're going to be a bit afraid to act, because we might be doing the wrong thing, or we might be doing it wrongly. And the other side is this sort of, and this is the storming sort of aspect of Tuckman's, that inevitably we're going to be jostling for position, jostling for hierarchy, because if that's not made clear, then to a degree it's kind of up for grabs. Who's senior, who's who's in charge, who's calling the shots, who's making decisions about certain parts of the project. And if that's not made clear, then people are going to jostle for position and try to get there. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it takes time. So if we've only got 2 weeks to deliver a project, but we spend the first week kind of finding out who sits where, we've lost a lot of time, and maybe we haven't even come to the sort of optimal structure anyway.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm going to bring another couple of questions in here because I think is a nice segue. Just as an aside, by the way, my favorite management theory fact is that Tupman's first names were Bruce Wayne. So I always think of him as the Batman theorist. The random stuff that's in my head. So question first of all from John Hayes, which is there some evidence you'd refer to with your clients to help them make the case for investing in psychological safety more tangible?
Oh, yeah.
Are there example of quantification of the benefits?
Good question. Yeah, so and depending on the client, yes, there are various bits of evidence. The most well-known one is Google's Project Aristotle. So the Project Aristotle 2013, led by Julia Rozovsky, and they found various factors that were crucial to high-performing teams. So structure and clarity, dependability, meaning, and one other that I can never remember, and foundational, but like fundamental to all of that was psychological safety. And they found it using, they knew something was missing. They found these things, but there were still big differences in the teams, and they couldn't work out what's the thing we're missing. And someone found Amy Edmonton's paper from 1999 when she was studying clinical teams, and used the same methodology to measure psychological safety, and that's how they found all their high-performing teams possessed high degrees of psychological safety. All their low-performing teams possessed very low levels of psychological safety. And the same research has now been done time and time again. But Google's Project Aristotle, certainly in industry, is the most well-known and most has the strongest argument in favor. There's loads of academic literature, but I tend to find if you're talking to C-level execs, they don't want to read a paper.
No, that's true. And is it demonstrably causal? Because there's one thing to say we found this correlating factor with all of our teams that they were high performing and they were psychologically safe. But if you've got a high performing team, is it a factor of many high performing teams that they are therefore psychologically safe?
Yeah, so yeah, good question. So it is causal, but it is also like we said earlier, kind of a virtuous cycle.
Yeah.
Because once you get to a degree of psychological safety where you can have conversations, you can also have conversations about psychological safety and how are we going to improve performance in a team, how are we going to mitigate these mistakes, come up with new ideas and do things better, but how are we going to behave with each other in safer, more inclusive ways? So, but unfortunately, the converse applies sort of down the bottom of psychological safety, where there is a lack of psychological safety. We don't even have the safety to talk about the subject. So teams can get stuck in that sort of pit, and it's hard to pull them out. Yeah,
no, I can understand that. And then a question from Kathleen Collier, which is there an impact of measuring psychological safety actually on psychological safety?
Yes, absolutely. And this is, so that's actually one. So a lot of people come to me asking me to help them do a survey, create a survey, measure psychological safety across the organization. They need some help doing it, crafting the survey, designing the research and analyzing it and stuff like that. And we end up having quite a long discussion. I had a client last week who I consider quite a success because they've decided not to measure psychological safety as a result of our discussions. There's all sorts of things to take into account. One is opportunity cost. Could you simply be doing something better with your time than measuring psychological safety? But you've also got effects like Goodhart's law and Campbell's law that are you measuring the thing you think you're measuring? Are people just telling you what they think you want to hear? If there's any incentive at all for teams to score high on psychological safety, then there's going to be someone giving a nudge, applying some pressure to up the scores a little bit. There's also just a general sort of, I think it was Goldratt, wasn't it, who said, tell me how I'll be measured and I'll tell you how I'll behave. And so what do we we're inevitably, when we're measuring something, we're incentivizing something. We just don't know what it is until after the case. So measuring psychological safety can be powerful if done in a really, really careful way, usually alongside or as part of an existing engagement survey, like including some questions in that. So you're not explicitly measuring psychological safety, you're trying to get an indicator, trying to get a temperature check. But in many ways, you're back to thinking about how can we measure this in more qualitative ways? How can we have discussions, conversations, workshops, and get qualitative information that not only tells us how are we doing with this, how are we doing psychological safety? Are we low, high, or whatever? But where are the pockets of low safety? Where are the pockets of high safety? But those qualitative discussions and conversations will tell us what's going on in those pockets as well. So we can identify the good, constructive behaviors and practices that are contributing to psychological safety, and the things that are challenging and damaging psychological safety. And if we're just measuring it, we've only got to measure. We don't necessarily know what's causing that problem. We need to ask more questions in order to dive in and find what's damaging that. And that is often what's happened in the past. Has there been a reorg? Has someone left the team? What's going on? Yeah.
So many factors involved, aren't there? And
yeah, it's huge.
The complexity of the systems that are organizations. It's Goodhart and Campbell are my two favorite social science laws, by the way, because I'm the sort of person who has favorite social science laws. A few more questions then from the wonderful audience. Let's go with starts off with John Fulton, who asked, if joining a new team or organization, what are the first things that stand out that might lead you to infer the level of psychological safety? So a bit of a spin there, maybe about the sense making rather than the measurement that an individual might be able to use.
Oh, that's a good question. So there's a few things, and so I guess there's one side is sort of outcomes, and if you look at quality, safety, failure rates and success rates, those sorts of KPIs or those sorts of indicators will give you a suggestion of the level of psychological safety. If, just like in my experience, if you've got a team that are never making any mistakes, then they're either so afraid of making mistakes that they plan the hell out of everything, and because of the punishment, that aspect, or they're not reporting mistakes, which is more likely. So there's those sort of aspects to a degree. So the outcomes of the team, a poorly performing team, a poorly performing organization is likely to have trouble with psychological safety. But maybe an easier way is to listen and observe. And if people are saying things like, I need some help, can someone help me over here? I made a mistake. I have a question. I think we're doing this wrong. I think we should can this project. That's a really good indicator of psychological safety. I made a really big mistake. Can someone help me fix it? They're the indicators of high psychological safety. Fortunately, and in a kind of nice feedbacky way, they're also the things that help foster psychological safety. So by saying those things, by doing that, by admitting mistakes, by asking for help, particularly if we're in positions of leadership or privilege, then we're helping to foster psychological safety and model that behavior for others on the team.
I think that's really important, isn't it? That idea that by demonstrating your own humility, which a lot of this is about humility.
Yeah.
You're actually helping to be able to create an environment where others will start to open up as well.
Yeah.
A couple more questions then. Lindsay Pruitt, where do you start helping a culture that inherently has low trust due to their geopolitical historical context? This manifests itself in low trust, low transparency, and the problems these then cause. I guess also within that is almost, are there some organizations that there just isn't any hope for?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. I think there's a lot to play with here. There's a lot to examine here, and people are doing a lot of work in this area. first of all, an awful lot of the psychological safety literature is kind of very westernized, neurotypical, I have to say American, really, kind of businessy. It's in that context. It's described in that context. So if we look at, for example, there's different kind of cultures here. If we look at, for example, a software development team who are all sitting there with their headphones on in a dark room, quietly getting on with stuff, to someone else, to an American salesperson, that looks like, this team aren't psychologically safe, are they? But actually they are. They're just psychologically safe in their own way. They're just manifesting, behaving in a way that's psychologically safe for them. So there's that cultural aspect, but there's also geocultural aspect, national culture. But what I find most interesting there is that a lot of, so if you look at the Toyota production system, Taiichi Ohno's Toyota production system and the Andon cord and this whole system of work, that was designed from the very start to be a socio-technical system, appreciating human psychology as well as the system of work and the technical side, technical nature of work. You can't pull the two apart. We're people and machines working together, hopefully in harmony. And but what's really interesting is that that's from Japan, and Japan has a very hierarchical, very compliant sort of culture. You don't, in general, you don't speak up to your boss, you don't contradict your boss, you don't raise concerns or admit mistakes because of the interpersonal risk and the threat to your position, but also just that's not culturally the norm. However, Taiichi Ohno knew that this was, he knew inherently this was a problem. He knew that he'd have to create a system that meant people would speak up and raise concerns and suggest ideas and behave in ways that weren't natural to them. And that's why he created mechanisms like the Andon cord and the principle of Jidoka and Kaizen, and to flip this on its head to incentivize the behaviors that maybe go against or sort of that don't feel so natural to us. So whilst we have cultures that don't necessarily lean that way or don't look psychologically safe that way, we can always create scaffolds for psychologically safe behaviors or behaviors that foster psychological safety.
That's interesting. And something I've seen for many years now is that often people use the words culture and behavior almost as synonyms, or use the word culture when they actually mean behaviors.
Yes.
And I've very much been of the belief, still am of the belief, that if you want to affect behavioral change in an organization, it's far better to try to do it within the cultural context rather than trying to change the culture.
And
that sounds like what Toyota were doing, was creating a model that's enabled people to be able to speak up, but understanding the cultural, the cultural setting for how the Japanese hierarchical culture works.
Exactly. And I kind of believe, this is not founded, I have no evidence for this, but I kind of believe that the Toyota production system wouldn't have even emerged in the US, for example, and it emerged in Japan because the challenge was so apparent. The challenge is so apparent that people did not speak up with concerns or ideas or mistakes. But maybe they do in other cultures. They do, at least they do enough in other cultures that it isn't immediately apparently a problem.
And that also then, of course, when we start to look at being able to work in properly global teams, which is something we're starting to do, then you've got the additional layer of challenge of multiple cultures that are often in competition with one another or have very different views of how things go. And there's real complexity within that. There's a kind of anthropological challenges.
Yeah, there really is. And we can, and again, it comes back to having conversations and making what we believe to be implicit, making that explicit. I've worked with teams who, for example, have an American team and an Indian software development team, and they'll ask the Indian software development team to carry out tasks, to build something, to deliver something. And the answer is always yes. The answer is always, can you deliver this by next week? Yes. And because the culture is very compliant, the culture is you do what you're asked to do. What the person asking the question is, no, but can you? Like, can you deliver this next week, or is it 6 months away? That's the implied question. And so this is where we get into a lot of my work ends up been creation of team charters, social contracts, and things like that that make the nature of our communication and behavior explicit, and resolving any differences, any discrepancies, any misunderstandings or misalignments.
Yeah. And actually making things more explicit, I think, is another facet of the hybrid world.
Yeah.
Where you can't work on the tacit as much because it isn't manifesting itself quite as easily when you're in between Zoom.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah.
So one last question and then we'll wrap up. This is from Cy Cornwell. Whilst not a threat to life, making mistakes in tech change does impact business operations. It depends on the tech change. I was chatting to somebody yesterday whose career started in railway signalling systems, where tech change there will make actually life-changing mistakes. But reducing mistakes is still important. How do you balance doing things with care with psychological safety?
So I think this is a really good question, and I think sometimes, and I'm not saying this is in this case, but sometimes it's a bit of a misconception of psychological safety that it means a lowering of standards, a lowering of quality, a sort of more acceptance of it might just not work, it might, we might not deliver on time, that sort of approach. It's definitely not that. But again, it comes back to making things explicit that used to be implicit or not even understood, not even talked about. So having a discussion about definition of done, you'll be surprised how many, particularly outside of tech, no one has a definition of done. What does it mean to be finished? And the level of quality, and it's just sort of assumed that you'll just do it until it's finished. But what does finished mean? So we need to define finished. What does done mean? What does quality mean? What are the criteria in a really usable way? But also, what's safe to fail? What are the things we can do? Like, if we're asked to do something, is this safe to fail or is it not safe to fail? Am I running a marketing campaign that we don't actually know whether it will work or not, and it's really an experiment, and we'll see if it works or not? Or are we, writing some software for an intensive care unit that has to work? That it is not safe to fail. It has to work, and all the gradations in the middle. So, but having that conversation about what is safe to fail and what isn't safe to fail, and what elements are safe to fail, and what does it look like to be finished? What does it look like to be done? That's the power. But it's also, again, it's also a really, really fantastic way to foster greater psychological safety, because it means that we understand what's expected of us and where we can come up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes, because it makes all that explicit and it sets those boundaries in place where maybe before we didn't really know where they were, if we knew that they existed at all.
So what's next in your plan for world domination with all of this?
We're not really sure. We don't really know. We have a mission. Our mission is to make the world of work a safer, more inclusive, equitable, and higher performing place. That's our mission. I suspect, we're never going to be finished. That's our definition. That's never going to meet our definition of done. But we will keep working towards that and doing whatever we can do to make that a reality, and enjoying ourselves while we're doing it.
Fabulous. I've put a link to your website, which is psychsafety.co.uk, into the chat. There's also, so I've used it a fair bit in the past, actually, there's a toolkit that you have there, which there's some really great resources in there. Thank you very much, Tom. That's been a fascinating conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been fun.
Yeah, no, absolutely. A brief plug then for the next one. The next one's coming quite quickly, which is on Monday. I'm going to be talking with Olivia Gamblin. Olivia runs a business called Ethical Intelligence, and what her business does is to help her clients develop frameworks of being able to make decisions about the ethical impact of investment into particularly AI and data projects. She's somebody I've worked with in the past when I was heading up technology for a housing association. We were starting to look at particularly Internet of Things and data gathering from sensors in tenants' homes. So there was a whole wealth of ethical considerations that we need to do there. So we're going to talk a bit about how her business operates and the sorts of things that she does. Similar sort of format to this conversation, bit of a different topic. So hopefully that'll be good. And at the end of that one, I'll be looking for people in the network to give some feedback about how these have been and whether it's a useful way of us being able to help explore some things, but also kind of extend out our own networks a bit by understanding about some of these things that might be useful for clients of EE as well as for EE itself. So once again, Tom, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Matt.
We'll be back for the next one of these on Monday. And if you've got any questions, if you get to psychsafety.co.uk, you can find Tom on Twitter at Tom_Geraghty, is it?
Spot on.
Or you can route stuff through me as well, through Slack. Thanks, everyone. It's been a great session. Cheers.
Thanks, folks.